Alright folks, today I'm here once again to bring you yet another case of environmental storytelling in the Walking Dead universe. As most of you probably know, I already have an entire playlist with around 25 of these videos which you can click right here. But if this is somehow your first time watching, environmental storytelling is a filmmaking technique where a series of objects or bodies will be laid out in a way that conveys a story to the viewer without explicitly stating what that story is. In today's video, I'm going to be exploring the Ravaged cabin in the woods scene in Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, otherwise better known as Rick's final episode, which may be an extremely vague setup with very little screen time, but lends itself masterfully to this style of content. I'm going to structure this video by taking you through the scene as it was first presented, before going back and attempting to piece together what we discovered into a coherent story. So with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button, and if you've seen my videos come up in the past, why not drop a sub on your way out? I release new content just like this regularly. Following a nearly fatal accident involving a stick of rebar punctured through the abdomen, Rick Grimes had barely managed to avoid certain death by escaping an oncoming horde merely feet away. But unfortunately, the damage caused was rather severe, so despite squeezing through the cracks on his pale horse, the horde was tight on his trail with the smell of blood in the air. Luckily, while making his way down the road with the dead only inches behind, Rick would see a mailbox labeled Cardil, indicating the presence of a nearby home which could act as a good place to temporarily hold out and patch up his wounds. After doing a bit of research, I found out the name Cardil may be a reference to Laurie Cardil, who played Sarah in the 1985 film Day of the Dead. Spoilers for that film's ending if you somehow haven't seen it, but it concludes with Sarah escaping the dead via helicopter, which very clearly references the fate of Rick at the end of this episode. I don't necessarily think there's anything in the film that mirrors the scene we're about to analyze, so I think it's strictly meant to reference Rick's journey, but at the very least, it gives us a family name for who could have resided on this property. But making his way down the winding rural trail as fast as his injury could allow, Rick would come upon a lone cabin that has clearly seen better days. Right away, we not only see the structure in complete disrepair, but the greenery surrounding the cabin as well. Branches and small trees look to have been snapped in half, while leftover wood planks on the ground appear overgrown, indicating this place has been exposed to the elements with no maintenance for quite some time now. The windows look to have been frantically boarded up, and the front door lies blocked off with graffiti reading, "Come face me, assholes." On top of this, we see the side door completely ripped off its hinges with a flurry of bullet holes littering the cabin's interior. Obviously, walkers can't read, so this individual was clearly readying themselves for a human-on-human conflict, proven by the presence of two cold bodies lying on the floor that have been rotting there for what looks like months or even years. Now, the positioning of these bodies, along with their wounds, actually tells us a lot about what went down here. The first body we see is propped up against the wall with their gun on the floor, accompanied by a distinct bullet wound to the eye and what looks like multiple wounds to the chest behind a thick veil of spiderwebs. And only inches away, we see a second body on the floor of the cabin with a gun still in their hand, followed by what I suspect to be a self-inflicted bullet wound to the head and what could possibly be a wound to the leg. With no other bodies surrounding the exterior or interior of the cabin and the abundance of bullet holes in the walls, I can't help but believe this was some sort of ambush followed by a slide when things grew dire. And judging by the graffiti and frantic nature of the individuals taking shelter within, it seems this conflict had some sort of personal stake. Now, in terms of evidence, that's kind of all we got, but there are some things we can infer from these two that can help us put together a story. In my mind, this almost certainly had to be some sort of family-owned cabin these individuals were familiar with. Unless they chose the weakest structure imaginable to have their final stand, I believe this place had some sort of sentimental significance. So I'm gonna go ahead and assume these two were related in some way. Let's say brothers for the sake of the story. Though generally, all we really need to know is that they cared for each other enough to stand as one. I also find it very strange we don't see any supplies inside. It's totally possible a passerby could have taken it all in the years since, or maybe these two could have just been out of resources altogether. But to me, with evidence of an ambush, this whole scene looks extremely reminiscent of an attack by the Saviors. Let me take you back to Season 6, Episode 6, Always Accountable. Here we see Dwight, Sherry, and Tina fleeing through the forest with an army of relentless saviors on their tail as they had just fled the sanctuary after taking an abundance of supplies. We know this cabin is in the general vicinity of the sanctuary, and we know it's common for the saviors to track down defectors, especially if they took something of value. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say these brothers were on the run from the saviors for taking what wasn't theirs, and were violently attacked and left to rot once the stolen supplies was recaptured. The graffiti on the door reads, "Come face me, asshole, not us," which to me indicates one of the brothers was more aggressive and possibly the main target, while the other was more so there for support and simply got wrapped into the other's actions. But regardless of who was who and who did what, the cabin nearly experienced a third death that day when Rick drifted out of consciousness as a result of his wound, only to wake up with the horde right on top of him. Though, luckily, Officer Friendly would manage to escape through the boarded-up entrance and ride off on his pale horse once again, potentially leaving the cabin to collapse with the horde inside, bearing the remnants of this attack along with them. Now, regardless of what happened after Rick's escape, we now have enough evidence to go back and piece together a coherent story using what we discovered. But remember, I'm just theorizing based on what I've noticed, so it's entirely possible I can misinterpret or miss some evidence altogether. But as always, this is where you guys come in. I'd love to hear what you believe happened here in the comments down below. When society collapsed on August 27, 2010, two brothers sharing the Cardille family name found themselves banding together alone in the name of survival. Little was known about their lives before the outbreak, but judging by the indications of one brother, let's say the older of the two being the main target of this conflict, we can presume they were the more aggressive of the two, while the younger brother often followed their lead despite being well into their adult years, partially out of familial loyalty and partially due to long-term conditioning. The early days were rough for the Cardilles, as they often found themselves in dangerous situations due to the older brother's bullheaded nature. But nothing would compare to the peril they'd eventually be in once discovered and taken in by the Saviors. You see, the Saviors would often rescue stray survivors within the wasteland and promise them sanctuary. But this wasn't actually an altruistic act, as their home base effectively acted as a prison where workers would have to struggle for daily rations on the factory floor while the soldiers were spoiled with riches. Those who swore loyalty to their leader Negan and took on his name as their own would be granted a position among his ranks, but those who didn't play well with others, such as the older Cardille brother, would be forced to work until they got with the program, a prospect that, in this case, would never actually happen. For the year or so they were living this life of servitude, the younger brother simply kept his head down the best he could, but the older brother could no longer tolerate the unfair distribution of wealth, and would soon drag his brother into his plans. When they were taken in, they were promised a sanctuary, though in reality, this place was anything but. At the very least, the wasteland granted freedom. Anything you found while looting was yours. But here, they weren't even given a chance to find their own supplies, yet were forced to struggle regardless. This was hell for the older brother, who greatly struggled with authority, but was also way too big an organization to change or overthrow himself. So instead, when the time was right, he was gonna take what he believed he deserved and flee. The younger brother, however, was adamantly against this plan, as for the first time since the beginning, he didn't fear getting eaten alive in his sleep. But just as their dynamic had always worked while growing up, he wasn't asking him to come along, but demanding it. So obeying his brother while preparing to look out for him despite his reluctance, the younger brother would begin stealing and loading up whatever he could in the dead of night, while the older brother utilized his built-up connections within the sanctuary to secure a way out through bribing a guard. And by nightfall, the two were on foot, escaping through the wilderness. The brothers had grown up in Virginia and were quite familiar with the area, so despite now being on the run, they had a destination in mind. Their grandfather's old cabin in the woods, which in their minds was the perfect place to hide. Unfortunately for them, however, you can never really trust somebody within the sanctuary, so after only a couple hours of bushwhacking, the sound of approaching vehicles and on-foot saviors would make it obvious their ally had dined them out for escaping, scaring the two into picking up the pace. And eventually, despite leaving a distinct trail for the saviors to follow, the two would finally come upon the cabin where there was no time to waste. It wasn't a matter of if the saviors would find them, it was a matter of when, so frantically boarding up all the windows with whatever planks they could rip from the floorboards, the older brother would write a provoking message for their pursuers before locking themselves inside while preparing for what was to come. They couldn't run any longer. The saviors were much faster than them and capable of tracking for miles, so if they were going to protect what they took and survive the night, they were going to have to fight back. But unfortunately, without any visibility due to the darkness, it wouldn't be difficult for the saviors to silently surround the cabin where they knew their target was hunkered down. And although they could have attempted to talk them into surrendering, the older brother had made it abundantly clear they weren't looking to have a discussion. So as the soldiers began raising their barrels up towards the cabin walls, the brothers would listen intently for any sign of movement, before a sudden wave of bullets began peppering the cabin's interior. There was absolutely nowhere to hide, and despite the older brother's efforts to fight back in a similar manner, he could only take 3 or 4 shots to the chest before collapsing against the wall and sliding down. The younger brother, who had hit the deck in an effort to dodge the gunfire, would receive a bullet wound to the leg, preventing him from standing up or getting away. But before he could get the chance to beg his older brother for help, he would see his lifeless body already soaking the floor in red. There was no getting out of the situation, and he knew it. So raising his gun to his fallen brother and pulling the trigger to prevent reanimation, the younger brother would break down in tears while bleeding out on the floor. But before the saviors could push in and do God knows what to him, he would raise the gun to his head and pull the trigger, ending his suffering on his own terms. After the final shot rang out, the saviors would cautiously approach the side door, barely hanging onto its hinges, and rip it off before seeing the gruesome scene left inside. In their eyes, the brothers were traitors turned hostile, so tearing the cabin apart while searching for whatever they could, the remaining soldiers would collect the stolen resources, but leave the guns behind as some sort of sick joke or trophy to represent what happens when somebody betrays the saviors. And without looking back, the cabin and the Cardell brothers would be left to rot away like so many stories before. The older brother's actions are what brought this fate upon the two, but it was the younger brother who was forced to do the hardest part. Alright, now, is this interpretation of the story perfect? No, definitely not. I did have to take some liberties when characterizing the brothers, but I think it all fits well and doesn't go too over the top. In all honesty, there's not a ton of evidence that really indicates these two were even brothers in the first place, but I chose to go with that familial connection because I really like the dynamic it brought between the two and think it packs the ending with a solid emotional punch. Admittedly, however, I think the guns left behind were the hardest pieces of evidence to place. My thought process was that it was supposed to mirror how they document their kills with Polaroids, but you'll have to let me know if there's a better explanation for this. I mentioned in a community post a few days ago that I actually had to scrap my original version of this video due to a mistake I made during the analysis. The mistake is so dumb that I barely even want to say it, but I essentially built a whole story around a war between the two brothers because I misread the graffiti on the door as "Come face me, asshole," instead of "Come face me, assholes." When I noticed that, I realized there's no possible way this could have been a 1v1 conflict if there were multiple enemies, so I basically had to completely restart the story from the beginning. It's such a dumb mistake that cost me 2 days of work, so let this be a lesson to myself. But with that, I'm curious to hear what you think happened here. Do you believe my interpretation is correct? Do you have a better interpretation than what I came up with? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And once again, if you're a fan of this series, I have an entire playlist for you to check out right here. But that is gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.